Gunshots tore through the streets of Culiacán. Bodies swung from bridges, a grotesque warning for anyone who dared cross the Sinaloa Cartel. Convoys of armed men patrolled every intersection, marking territory with fire and fear. Entire neighborhoods froze, windows shuttered, the air thick with terror. And in the middle of it all, one message didn't make sense. A body, staged, hanging where no one should have dared. Who sent it? Why now? And what does it mean for the city, the cartel, and anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? By the end of this video, you're going to see the night Culiacán streets became a battlefield, and the secret behind the hung bodies that authorities won't talk about.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
I arrived in Culiacán just after dusk. The sun had already slipped behind the hills of the Rio Culiacán Valley, but the air still carried the heat of the day, humid, heavy, full of latent tension. I stepped out of the rental car onto Calle Reforma, and the city felt silent. A stillness that didn't promise safety, but suspense. I had come to cover an escalation in violence inside the Sinaloa Cartel, but on this night, I sensed I would be witness to something darker than reportage. The streets were mostly empty. A few taxis lined the curb, a shuttered convenience store's neon sign flickered. Streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional hum of a motorcycle broke the quiet. But what caught my attention first was the siren, an ambulance or police unit tearing past with its lights flashing, its wail echoing off the buildings, carrying a message: the war had come home. I set my recorder in my pocket, pulled on a hoodie, and began walking toward the north exit of the city, along Federal Highway 15, a major artery that threads out of Culiacán toward the coast. Locals had told me that area had become a stage for public shows of terror. I wanted to see for myself. Less than 30 minutes later, I reached a poorly lit bridge spanning the highway. It was a gray structure, functional, unremarkable. But tonight it was ominous. A few dozen meters ahead, crowd control tape, yellow, fluttering in the breeze, marked off a segment of the road. State police vehicles sat with lights on, blue and red reflections bouncing off the underbridge concrete. Journalists and bystanders kept their distance. I crouched behind a police car and unfolded my notebook. It was then that I saw them, for bodies hanging upside down, feet bound, each suspended from the bridge structure by rope. Their clothing was bullet-riddled, and late May's dusk shadows made the scene grotesque and surreal. I pressed record. The official investigation later revealed that all four were decapitated. At that moment, I saw only silhouettes. But I knew what I was looking at. A message. Heralded by violence. Nearby, parked beneath the bridge, was a white van. Its rear doors were flung open. Inside lay 16 more bodies, at least one of them also decapitated, stacked in the cargo hold, a large plastic bag with severed heads placed on the road next to the van. I glimpsed the edges of a narco banner, white cloth, black spray-painted message, and I recorded its wording later, the signature of the faction known as La Mayoza, a splinter group of the Sinaloa Cartel. The message targeted members of the rival faction known as Los Chapitos. The next morning, I verified this with local press and law enforcement sources. I stood there, frozen, phone camera idling. The wind blew a ragged banner half-detached, a single motorbike with masked riders paused, revved, and sped off. Police-gloved hands examined shell casings and bullet-splattered asphalt. A sense of shock enveloped me, not only because of the sheer brutality, but because this was open, unhidden, in the heart of what once seemed like a quiet capital of Sinaloa state. Why was I here? I'd come to document the civil war inside the Sinaloa Cartel, the fight for control that erupted between Mayo Zambada's loyalists, La Mayoza, and the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Los Chapitos. The fracture had been building for months. The crack widened in July 2024 when authorities believed the capture of senior figures triggered the split. But nothing prepared me for the scale of the message tonight. Hanging bodies. A bridge turned gallows. This was displayed. Not hidden. The war was no longer concealed in rural ambushes or remote roadblocks, it was being broadcast to every driver who exited Culiacán toward the coast, to every resident who dared to look out their window at sunset. As I walked around the scene, an extra-official source whispered, "This is just the beginning." He pointed to the banner, Mayo's men telling the Chapitos who is now in charge. He swallowed hard and added, "They want the people to know who they serve." I logged his quote in my notebook. Later cross-checked it. It aligned with other sources that reported the war had left more than 1,000 dead and thousands missing since September 2024. Walking back into the city's center, the atmosphere had changed. A sense of fear, shops with windows boarded up, early closures, children dropped off quickly. In the arcade near the government plaza, people scurried home before dark. No one wanted to be caught outside when the night deepened. I asked the taxi driver about his routes. He shook his head and whispered, "I stay off the highway after dark." Reflection question for you: if you were living in a city where the bodies of unknown victims were hung in plain view to send a message, how would you feel? Would you keep your routine, or would fear force you into hiding? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The helicopter rotors overhead caught my attention. Army Black Hawks. Their presence had grown in Sinaloa since the escalation. I checked my watch, just past 9 p.m. More than 4 hours since I first saw the bridge. I knew I needed to pull back, to file my footage, my notes, and regroup. But as I drove away, the city behind me seemed to exhale a shuddering breath. Its quiet was fragile. The war had already infiltrated its veins. Back at the hotel room, I reviewed my recording, the van, the banner, the bodies, the rope marks, the hasty fixings of the display. I made notes of the shell casing patterns and the forensic tape. I sent a message to my editor: massive escalation. Public display. Need full story. The scene would become a watershed moment, the moment when Culiacán's relative invisibility to the world's media was shattered. The next day's press in Mexico City would run headlines: 4 bodies hung from bridge in Culiacán and van with 16 bodies discovered in Sinaloa. The fact that I was standing there at the moment made me both privileged and small, privileged to record the truth, small because the truth was horror. What struck me most, the methodical nature of the violence. This was not chaos, it was choreography. The message was clear. The reach was wide. And the stakes had changed. This war was no longer hidden in the hills, it was visible to anyone passing the highway, anyone living in the city. As I drifted to sleep later that night, I could still hear the hum of the highway, faint but persistent. A reminder that the battle lines were everywhere. The next day I would begin tracing back how we got to this moment, the origins of the Sinaloa split, the figures of El Mayo Zambada and the sons of El Chapo, the corridors of power within the cartel, and the terror being unleashed upon the streets of Culiacán. But for this night, the memory of those 4 bodies suspended by rope haunted me. I felt grief, I felt anger, I felt the creeping realization, nothing would ever be the same here. When people think of Culiacán, they often picture the headlines, raids, arrests, convoys of soldiers, but before the night of the bridge, the city breathed a rhythm that was almost ordinary. I remember walking the Malecón in early 2024, families buying elotes at dusk, teenagers leaning on railings with phones in hand, music spilling from parked cars. The scent of grilled carne asada mixed with the humidity rising off the river. On the surface, life looked stable. Yet beneath that calm ran two invisible currents, money and fear. Everyone knew that Sinaloa's economy had long depended on two faces of the same coin. Agriculture, the tomatoes, peppers, and corn shipped north, and the drug trade that used the same roads, trucks, and warehouses. In cafes, people spoke in code. They called it La Empresa, the company. It was a system that had sustained families for decades, feeding both legitimate and illicit livelihoods. As a journalist, I had followed the Sinaloa story for years. The organization's roots reach back to the 1980s, when farmers in the mountains of the Golden Triangle, Sinaloa, Durango, Chihuahua, began trafficking marijuana and heroin. Out of those valleys emerged names that would become global shorthand for the trade: Héctor Luis Palma, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. By the mid-1990s, El Chapo and Ismael El Mayo Zambada had turned the Sinaloa group into a federation, an alliance of families controlling routes across western Mexico. The cartel operated less like a single army and more like a network of franchises. Each cell handled its own logistics but paid tribute upward. When one leader was jailed or killed, another relative or lieutenant kept business running. That structure made it resilient, too decentralized to dismantle with a single arrest. Then came El Chapo's final capture in 2016 and his extradition to the United States. What followed was a slow unraveling. His longtime partner, El Mayo, remained free, but a generational shift began. Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio, took control of parts of the business. For a while, they coexisted with Mayo's faction. Each managed different corridors: synthetic drugs moving through the Pacific ports, cocaine shipments arriving from South America, and local security operations. By 2023, that fragile balance started to fracture. U.S. indictments accused Los Chapitos of driving fentanyl production. El Mayo's lieutenants quietly resented the attention and the chaos the younger bosses attracted. Federal reports described at least two separate networks of laboratories and smugglers now operating under what was once a single name. Rival safe houses appeared on opposite sides of Culiacán. Inside the city, the shift was almost invisible at first. The baker still opened his shop at 6 a.m., children still walked to school. But people noticed new SUVs without license plates cruising main avenues. Some nights, bursts of gunfire echoed from the outskirts. On social media, residents posted videos of convoys and deleted them minutes later. You learn not to ask who was fighting whom, you learn to stay home after dark. For journalists, covering those changes meant careful choreography. We met sources only in daylight, avoided recording equipment that could be traced, never printed a name without triple-checking. In the newsroom, editors debated how far we could go. Reporting on cartel movements was a line between public interest and self-preservation. We knew colleagues who had crossed it. In late 2024, the balance collapsed. When Ovidio Guzmán was rearrested that January after a chaotic failed capture the previous year, rumors spread that parts of the organization blamed Mayo's men for not intervening. Retaliations followed: ambushes in rural Sinaloa, disappearances, burned warehouses. By spring 2025, authorities and independent monitors counted hundreds of killings linked to internal purges. Still, daily life continued. Markets opened. Soccer matches filled local fields. The resilience of ordinary residents was astonishing. But fear became a silent habit. People checked messages before leaving home, memorized alternate routes, noted where military checkpoints appeared. In May 2025, chatter on encrypted channels hinted that one faction planned a public display against the other. At first, none of us believed it. The Sinaloa organization had always prided itself on keeping violence low profile in its home state. But whispers turned to warnings. Government intelligence briefings leaked to the press mentioned unusual coordination among hit squads near Culiacán. That week, I booked my ticket south. My editor asked if I was sure. I said yes. Years covering Mexico's drug war had taught me that the story of Sinaloa wasn't only about power, it was about the people who lived under its shadow. To understand the night of the bridge, you had to understand the silence that came before it. So I arrived in a city pretending everything was normal, yet bracing for something extraordinary. Soldiers patrolled intersections in pairs, police leaned on pickup trucks sipping coffee, and the air was thick with a tension no one named aloud. Every source I met repeated the same phrase, "Esto se va a poner feo." It's going to get ugly. I believed them, but I didn't grasp how soon. When you sense danger building quietly around you, do you stay to bear witness, or step back to protect yourself? Share what you'd have done. The night that followed would answer that question for me, and for Culiacán itself. By early May 2025, it became impossible to ignore the signals. Culiacán's usual rhythm, the distant hum of motorcycles, the clatter of markets, the slow flow of buses along the Avenida Álvaro Obregón, was punctuated by signs I had learned to recognize over years of covering Mexico's organized crime: tension in the streets, unusual movement of armored SUVs, and whispers among my sources that a major factional shift was imminent. I had been tracking the Sinaloa Cartel for over a decade. From the mountains of Durango to the coastal ports near Mazatlan, I had seen the organization operate as a federation, with each cell paying tribute upward, loyalty enforced quietly, and violence strategically hidden from public view. But something was changing. The balance between the sons of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, collectively called Los Chapitos, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada's loyalists was cracking. The first real tip came from a federal intelligence contact, someone who had briefed me periodically over the past 3 years. He was careful with words, always asking to meet in public spaces with cameras and microphones nowhere near. Over coffee at a discreet cafe near downtown, he laid out a pattern that had emerged in the past 6 months, a spike in violent incidents along known trafficking corridors, reports of new safe houses in neighborhoods previously considered quiet, and encrypted communications hinting at retribution campaigns between the factions. "They're preparing something big," he said, voice low enough for a few tables away to hear nothing. "Not just a clash in the mountains this time. This will happen in the city. In Culiacán itself." I jotted notes furiously. I asked him to clarify, were these warnings based on arrests, intercepted messages, or mere rumors? He hesitated, then leaned forward. "All of it. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Los Chapitos are consolidating, yes, but Mayo's men are pushing back. There's movement on both sides. Vehicles, armed men, and, most importantly, messages being sent. Public ones." It struck me immediately, the public part. This was not going to be the usual quiet retaliation, this was meant to send a message. Over the next days, I began cross-referencing his information with open-source reporting and police logs. Local law enforcement confirmed that armored SUVs had been observed entering the city in larger numbers than normal. Some were registered to shell companies, others unmarked entirely. Footage from highway toll cameras showed groups of heavily armed men traveling at night. Rumors of planned blockades circulated on encrypted apps, residents noticed more checkpoints, more patrols, and an unusual number of motorcycles with blacked-out plates moving through the city's streets. Each piece on its own could be dismissed. But together, they painted a clear trajectory toward escalation. I spoke with 2 more sources that week, one, a retired municipal officer who had been observing the Chapitos recruitment tactics, and the other, an anonymous analyst embedded with the state intelligence unit. Both independently corroborated that the growing conflict was not confined to rural areas. Both warned that a show of power in the city center was imminent. The term public display was used repeatedly. I recorded these warnings verbatim in my notebook. At the same time, I noticed something else. The cartel's internal communication network was unusually active. I could not, and would not, intercept messages illegally, but monitoring news chatter, leaked reports, and social media rumors allowed me to see patterns. Encrypted channels among local gangs showed heightened activity. Local journalists whispered of unusual traffic to certain districts. Unexplained burnings of vehicles, previously isolated incidents, appeared more frequent in certain neighborhoods. Each of these minor events was a thread in a larger tapestry. As I compiled these threads, I began to understand the inevitability of the night to come. A civil war had silently taken hold of Culiacán, and the city itself was about to become a stage. The warning signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them: armored convoys during off hours, encrypted chatter hinting at retaliation, the arrival of hit teams from outlying towns, sudden disappearances of key lieutenants, and a marked increase in public threats issued via banners and graffiti. I felt a knot in my stomach. Reporting on cartel activity has always carried risks, but this was different. The intelligence suggested an event so brazen it would leave visible evidence. My sources made one point repeatedly: this is meant to be seen. The message is as important as the violence itself. The night before the eventual public attack, I drove through the northern districts of Culiacán, checking checkpoints, observing unusual congregations of armed men in alleys, noting the locations of armored SUVs. Every instinct told me that by dawn, the city would wake up to a scene that would shock the world. In the newsroom, I prepared a story brief for editors. I included verified sources, images of traffic patterns, and maps of likely conflict zones. I also emphasized the need for discretion. This was not an event to cover live on social media. Accuracy and safety were paramount. Yet, even as I filed my notes, I felt a growing urgency. Each call I made, each confirmation I received, painted a terrifying picture. The war between Los Chapitos and Mayo's faction was moving into the open, and the public stage would be the heart of Culiacán. By late evening, the tension became almost tangible. Officers whispered of suspicious movements near the highway bridges. Residents reported the sudden disappearance of several local youths linked, through rumor, to cartel activity. Every detail, while unconfirmed in court or press releases, converged into one undeniable fact: tomorrow, something catastrophic would occur. And so I sat in my small rented apartment that night, listening to the hum of traffic outside, checking my notes repeatedly. My recorder was ready. My camera, on a tripod, was charged. And my mind raced with a single question: would the city survive this message from the Sinaloa Cartel, or would it become another casualty of the civil war I had spent years tracking? When evidence points to an impending disaster, how far would you go to witness it? Would you step closer to document the truth, or retreat for your safety? Comment below. By dawn, the events that had been quietly building would explode across Culiacán, leaving a mark that would define this city, and my career, as a witness to one of the most audacious displays in the history of the Sinaloa Cartel. The morning after the warnings, Culiacán felt heavier than usual, as if the city itself sensed the storm building within its streets. I stepped out onto Avenida Álvaro Obregón before sunrise, notebook in hand, camera tucked beneath my jacket. The humidity clung to me, but the air was not the usual warmth of early summer. It carried something else: anticipation, unease, the metallic scent of tension. From my vantage point, I could see the first signs of escalation. Armored SUVs patrolled in small convoys, moving with an unusual synchronicity that suggested coordination beyond random routine. Federal agents were stationed at key intersections, their rifles slung across chests, eyes scanning every vehicle that passed. The soldiers' presence had grown in both number and visibility since the unrest had intensified over the past weeks. I made my way to the northern districts, an area of Culiacán that had historically been quieter, but now increasingly under surveillance. Residents were beginning to alter their routines. Vendors arrived later, shops opened doors cautiously, and taxis avoided routes that intersected known conflict zones. Conversations whispered hints. Did you see the men last night? Armed? Which side are they for? It was clear that the divide between Los Chapitos and Mayo Zambada's loyalists was no longer confined to rural strongholds, it was creeping into urban life. My first source that morning was a local police officer, someone who had consistently provided insight on previous cartel activity. Over coffee in a dimly lit cafe, he shared what he could without putting himself, or me, at risk. "They're testing the city," he said quietly. "Blockages, checkpoints, visible patrols, they want the people to see and know who's in charge. If anyone crosses the line, the consequences are visible." I scribbled every word, aware of the journalist's challenge: confirm, verify, contextualize. The pattern emerging was unmistakable. Los Chapitos were asserting territorial control, but Mayo's faction was responding with calculated demonstrations of force. It wasn't just a battle of firearms, it was a battle of visibility, of messaging, of psychological dominance over the city's residents. Later, I visited the city's central market. Conversations were more guarded now. Vendors avoided names, referred to groups only as the company or the bosses. Occasionally, someone would glance nervously toward the entrances, lowering their voice to recount a story they'd heard: armored vehicles moving at night, cryptic banners appearing on rooftops, rumors of people being disappeared. Every anecdote, every rumor, was a thread I had to follow, each hinting at the larger tapestry of conflict. By mid-morning, I had received encrypted messages from a contact within the federal intelligence community. The pattern was now undeniable. Multiple locations across the city had seen suspicious convoys, armed men arriving and leaving within the span of minutes. Safe houses had been identified, and some were known to harbor high-ranking members of Los Chapitos. Another set of locations had been monitored by Mayo's loyalists, suggesting prepositioning for an open confrontation. What fascinated, and terrified, me was the strategic nature of these movements. These were not spontaneous acts, the choreography suggested months of planning. The city itself was a chessboard, and the players were willing to leave public marks, reminders of who controlled what. In the afternoon, I crossed paths with an investigative colleague who had been monitoring social media chatter and local forums. He showed me videos of groups of men carrying firearms in neighborhoods previously considered safe. Even blurred, even anonymized, the footage conveyed intent. They were showing presence, sending warnings, and marking territory. I spent the remainder of the day corroborating every piece of information. I mapped vehicle movements, compared eyewitness accounts, reviewed satellite imagery provided by open-source platforms, and cross-referenced government reports. The pieces converged into a singular, inescapable conclusion: the city was on the brink of an open display of violence. Night approached, but the tension did not abate. Traffic patterns had changed, shops closed early, and families stayed indoors. Even without guns firing, Culiacán felt like a city under siege. Every street, every alleyway, every corner had become a potential stage for the conflict between Los Chapitos and Mayo Zambada's faction. I returned to my hotel room to compile notes. The map of potential conflict points grew increasingly dense, almost too vast to track. Every lead pointed to one inevitable outcome: The factions were preparing a public demonstration, a signal to each other, and to the world, that control of Culiacán was contested. As I wrote, I realized the city itself had become a participant in the civil war. Ordinary residents had no choice but to adapt, to hide, to observe, to survive. The psychological tension was palpable. That evening, I reviewed my recordings of conversations with sources, video footage from earlier in the day, and satellite imagery. Patterns emerged, vehicles repeatedly returning to certain districts, unusual groupings of armed men, communications that suggested coordination. Each new piece confirmed my worst suspicions. The bloody night that had been foreshadowed by weeks of signals was imminent. And yet, there were still unknowns. Who would act first? Where would the first public demonstration occur? How many would be affected? These questions would drive me back into the streets at night, camera and notebook in hand, a witness to history in the making. As someone documenting unfolding violence, how would you balance the need for truth with personal safety? Would you stay on the scene or retreat? Share your perspective below. By the time darkness fell, Culiacán's quiet facade had fully cracked. From my vantage point, the streets seemed both familiar and foreign. The signals I had gathered, the intelligence tips, the vehicle movements, the encrypted chatter, coalesced into one inescapable truth: the city was on the edge of a bloody confrontation, and the next hours would change it forever. As the sun set over Culiacán, the city's usual hum had transformed into a tense, almost mechanical silence. I moved carefully through the streets, notebook and camera ready, eyes scanning every shadowed corner. The morning's intelligence had laid out clear divisions: Los Chapitos controlling certain districts, Mayo Zambada's loyalists entrenched in others. By all reports, it was a clean, predictable line of conflict, territorial, calculated. That assumption, I was about to learn, was wrong. Late in the afternoon, a federal analyst I had met weeks earlier called with an urgent update. He had intercepted a series of communications suggesting something unexpected: loyalists on both sides were shifting allegiances. Individuals previously counted as Mayo's supporters were now being seen with Chapitos convoys, and vice versa. They're planting confusion, he warned. These aren't mistakes, they're messages. Certain leaders want the other faction to think they're losing control, while consolidating power elsewhere. I quickly cross-referenced this with my own surveillance and sources on the ground. What I discovered was unsettling. Vehicles previously assigned to one faction were being repainted or relocated, safe houses previously monitored were suddenly empty, and intercepted chatter suggested the use of double agents. The carefully mapped lines of control were dissolving into something far more chaotic and dangerous. I realized, in that moment, that the city was a living battlefield of deception. The predictable pattern I had been relying on, the assumption that the factions would stick to their known territories, was now unreliable. The violence I had anticipated would not only be intense, it would be strategically confusing, maximizing both fear and chaos. Later, I met with a retired officer, someone who had previously tracked movements of Los Chapitos. He confirmed my suspicion: it's psychological warfare, he said. They're not just fighting each other, they're fighting perception. They want everyone to question who is in charge, who to trust, and which areas are safe. That revelation changed everything about my reporting. The night I had been preparing for, the public display of violence, the message from the factions, would not be straightforward. I would need to track multiple simultaneous events across different neighborhoods, anticipate deception, and document a story that was shifting beneath my feet in real time. As evening deepened, I drove past districts that had been relatively quiet all day, and I noticed subtle, almost imperceptible signs of preparation: vehicles parked in odd positions, groups of men moving quickly through alleyways, street cameras briefly covered with tape. Even without direct confrontation, the city itself felt like it had become part of the narrative, complicit in the psychological tension being built by both factions. By nightfall, I had compiled a map of activity that suggested the upcoming public display was not localized. Multiple locations were being prepared simultaneously, each with bodies of evidence meant to communicate a message. The predictable choreography I had been expecting was gone. In its place was a network of carefully timed, simultaneous acts designed to confuse and terrorize. The midpoint twist crystallized in my mind as I reviewed all collected intelligence. The factions were not just fighting each other, they were manipulating the city's perception, and the violence would be more public, more symbolic, and far more devastating than anyone anticipated. I realized that my role as an investigative journalist had become even more critical. I was no longer documenting a straightforward clash. I was attempting to capture a narrative in which the city itself was both witness and participant, where every street corner could tell a story of allegiance, betrayal, and calculated terror. By midnight, encrypted messages confirmed that coordinated action was imminent. Sources indicated that the first public displays, vehicles abandoned with threatening messages, banners on key streets, would occur within hours. My mind raced. How many locations could I safely document? How could I capture the unfolding story without endangering myself or bystanders? And then came another, even more unsettling piece of information. Some of the planned displays were not aimed at rival factions but at local residents, a clear message that obedience and fear were equally critical components of the Civil War. This revelation reframed the entire conflict. The violence was not only about territory or factional supremacy, it was about control of the population, a chilling reminder that the cartel's reach extended into every facet of daily life. As I prepared my equipment for the long night ahead, I felt the full weight of the moment. The city I thought I understood was a puzzle with shifting pieces. The lines of control were blurred. Allies could not be counted on, and the streets themselves had become unpredictable. My reportage would need to capture not only the actions of the factions but the psychological landscape of a city under siege. If you discovered that the lines between friend and enemy were not what they seemed, how would you navigate danger while trying to uncover the truth? Share your perspective in the comments. By the time I finished reviewing my notes and maps, it was past 2 a.m. The first signs of the public display, the calculated, orchestrated acts of terror designed to send a message, would unfold before sunrise. Every source I had spoken to, every piece of intelligence collected, pointed to a single, unavoidable conclusion: Culiacán was about to witness a night unlike any in its history, and I would be there to document it. By the time the first hints of dawn began to fade, Culiacán was already awake in a way that defied the city's normal rhythms. I had left my hotel around 4 a.m., navigating streets that were eerily quiet, yet charged with an unmistakable tension. Surveillance cameras and streetlights cast long shadows, and I kept my recorder in one hand and my camera ready, notebook tucked beneath my jacket. Every instinct as a journalist told me to proceed with caution, every instinct as a human being told me to step back. The first signs of the public displays were subtle but unmistakable. In several northern districts, vehicles had been abandoned in intersections, some with banners indicating allegiance to either Los Chapitos or Mayo Zambada's loyalists. Rumors of armed men moving through alleys were confirmed by distant gunfire and the occasional crackle over police radios that I could hear from a safe distance. Residents peered cautiously from windows, some stayed inside entirely. As I documented these signs, a federal analyst contacted me with updates from intercepted communications. Coordination between factions was tight, confirming what I had suspected during the midpoint twist. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence. This was premeditated, simultaneous, and designed to leave a public impression. The psychological element was clear: the intent was to demonstrate power over territory, rivals, and the population. Driving carefully along Avenida Enrique Sanchez Alonso, I observed convoys moving deliberately through key districts. SUVs with tinted windows carried armed men, their patterns confirming intelligence reports I had gathered earlier in the week. Safe houses were occupied intermittently, suggesting tactical positioning rather than random activity. Everywhere I looked, the signs of strategic orchestration were present. At 6 a.m., I reached the northern bridge I had scouted days earlier. From a distance, I could see the first banners and warning signs being set up. Authorities were present, but their numbers were insufficient to fully control the scene. Local police and federal agents worked in concert to monitor activity while minimizing civilian exposure, but the chaos of simultaneous, coordinated moves by armed groups made containment nearly impossible. By mid-morning, the city's tension reached its peak. Reports of armed confrontations in several neighborhoods were confirmed by both intelligence sources and citizen footage circulating on encrypted platforms. The anticipated public display was underway, vehicles strategically placed, messages broadcast via banners and graffiti, and armed men moving openly in broad daylight, sending unmistakable signals to both rival factions and residents. Walking through secondary streets, I documented the psychological impact on the community. Families moved cautiously, children were kept indoors, and business owners boarded up shop windows hours before any actual confrontation occurred. Even without direct violence, fear had already taken root, a critical objective of the faction's coordinated plan. It was then that I received a tip from a reliable source embedded within state intelligence. A key figure from Los Chapitos was moving through a district typically controlled by Mayo's loyalists. The implication was clear, a symbolic act of defiance or a tactical maneuver to consolidate influence. My recorder was running as I took notes, mapping the movement in real time, cross-referencing it with previously gathered surveillance and reports. Hours passed, and the city became a mosaic of calculated chaos. Convoys, banners, and armed groups were no longer isolated incidents, they were interconnected, demonstrating a level of orchestration I had never witnessed in Culiacán. Each movement, each visible sign, was part of a psychological narrative, control was contested, and power was public. From my position on a rooftop near the central market, I could see activity across multiple blocks simultaneously. My camera captured convoy movements, banners being raised, and armed men patrolling strategic points. Using encrypted communications, I confirmed some of these movements with federal sources. Each confirmation reinforced the reality: the civil war had spilled into the public sphere, and the city itself was now part of the message. During the late afternoon, reports arrived of sporadic firefights on the periphery. These were limited in scale but significant symbolically. Each skirmish underscored the reach of both factions and the willingness to operate openly in the urban environment. Residents continued to observe from safe distances, documenting activity on mobile devices but remaining out of the crossfire. By early evening, the full scope of the public displays was undeniable. Vehicles had been abandoned with clear factional messages, strategic checkpoints were manned by armed personnel, and banners communicated allegiance, threats, and territorial claims. From my vantage points, I could track movements across multiple districts simultaneously, cross-referencing them with intelligence sources. The narrative emerging was chilling yet fascinating. This was a civil war conducted as a psychological operation, a calculated series of actions designed to assert dominance and control perception. As night fell, I reviewed my notes and footage. The scale and coordination of the events were unprecedented. My role as a journalist had become one of careful observation, analysis, and documentation. Every street, every banner, every convoy movement contributed to the story of a city under siege not only by gunfire but by the pervasive, invisible hand of psychological manipulation. If you were witnessing coordinated, citywide unrest designed to intimidate an entire population, would you document it for the world, or prioritize personal safety? How would you balance these priorities? Comment below. By midnight, I finally returned to my hotel room, exhausted and tense. I had collected hours of footage, detailed notes, and intelligence cross-references. The city had lived through the first day of open, public confrontation between Los Chapitos and Mayo Zambada's loyalists. And as I reviewed my material, I realized this was only the beginning. The next phase, hidden movements, retaliation, and further public displays, would define the next days of the Sinaloa Civil War, and I would need to stay alert to capture the full scope of this unprecedented event. After the first night of coordinated public displays, I spent the next morning reviewing footage, transcripts, and my notes. Culiacán's streets had returned, superficially, to their usual rhythm. Vendors opened their stalls, buses resumed regular routes, and children walked to school. But beneath this thin veneer of normalcy, the city was fractured, tense, and strategically partitioned by invisible lines of influence. As I examined the patterns of armored vehicle movements, reported skirmishes, and intercepted communications, a realization began to emerge. The violence was not random, it followed a meticulously designed strategic framework. Each convoy, each banner, each barricade was part of a broader psychological campaign intended to communicate dominance, intimidate rivals, and assert territorial control. I reached out to my most trusted intelligence contact, the federal analyst who had first warned me weeks before. Over a secure line, he confirmed a critical insight that reshaped my understanding of the Civil War. Both factions were using the city itself as a message board. Every street, every intersection, every public space is a signal, he said. This is why the displays are simultaneous, coordinated, and visible. They want everyone watching, the other faction, the government, the civilians, to understand who holds power where. It was a breakthrough in my reporting. Previously, I had been documenting discrete events, treating each convoy or abandoned vehicle as an isolated incident. Now, I saw the larger network, the pattern that tied seemingly random events into a single, strategic operation. The Civil War was not just about territory, it was about perception, control, and intimidation. That insight changed the way I approached the streets. I began mapping not just the movements of armed men, but the spatial psychology of the city, the neighborhoods most affected, the areas left deliberately quiet, the routes used for signaling. Cross-referencing intelligence, citizen reports, and my own observations, I identified key nodes where the next major public displays were likely to occur. By late afternoon, I had compiled a working hypothesis. The factions were preparing a coordinated symbolic act at multiple sites simultaneously. The objective was not only to eliminate rival operatives but also to send a citywide signal that power had shifted. The strategic design was intricate. Some locations were bait, designed to draw attention, while others were intended to consolidate influence quietly. This breakthrough prompted a critical decision. I could continue documenting from a safe distance, piecing together the story afterward, or I could position myself closer to the unfolding events to capture the immediacy and scale of the operation. As a journalist, the choice was clear. I had to witness the events as they happened, without compromising safety. I coordinated with trusted local contacts to gain insight into areas where movement was likely but where civilian exposure could be minimized. Using mapped intelligence, I identified vantage points that would allow observation and documentation without entering the line of direct conflict. This careful planning was essential. Every misstep could compromise my safety or the safety of those around me. As evening approached, I returned to one of the primary districts of activity. From a rooftop overlooking a wide intersection, I could observe multiple convoys, armed groups, and the preparation of symbolic displays. Each movement confirmed the pattern I had identified earlier: coordinated, deliberate, and designed to be visible to the public. The realization was sobering. This was a civil war conducted not only through force but through careful orchestration of fear and perception. My recorder captured the ambient sounds, distant sirens, the hum of engines, and the low murmur of voices communicating in code. The psychological impact on residents was already evident. Shop owners closed early, families stayed indoors, and the usual morning rush had shifted to an unnerving stillness. I documented this, knowing that the story I was gathering was about more than just factional conflict. It was about the effect of strategic intimidation on a city's population. Late at night, an unexpected piece of intelligence arrived. A colleague monitoring social media chatter had identified unusual activity at a previously unmonitored location. Videos suggested that armed men were staging banners and marking positions in a way that had not been previously recorded. This confirmed the pattern of simultaneous, multi-location signaling and underscored the sophistication of the faction's strategy. At that moment, I realized that the inner breakthrough from my reporting was complete. I was no longer documenting isolated acts of violence. I was observing a coordinated civil war conducted with precision, where perception was as critical as physical dominance. This understanding would shape how I approached the climax of the events and how I would interpret the unfolding chaos for the audience. As I prepared for the final night of observation, I reflected on the resilience and courage required, not only by myself as a journalist but by the citizens of Culiacán. They had lived through intimidation, fear, and uncertainty, yet continued their routines as best they could. The city itself had become both witness and participant in a complex psychological narrative orchestrated by the Sinaloa Cartel. When patterns of violence are hidden within chaos, how do you decide what is truly significant? How would you, as an observer, identify the turning point? Share your thoughts below. By midnight, the city had quieted again, but this was the calm before the climax. From my vantage point, I could see the positioning, the signals, and the deliberate choreography that had been building for weeks. The civil war in Culiacán was reaching its peak, and I was ready to witness the events that would define this historic moment. The night had fallen fully over Culiacán, and the city's quiet surface belied the storm beneath. I positioned myself on a rooftop overlooking a major intersection, where intelligence and on-the-ground reports suggested one of the primary symbolic displays would occur. From this vantage, I could observe multiple simultaneous events: armored convoys moving strategically, banners and graffiti being placed, and armed men patrolling key points. The scale of coordination was unlike anything I had documented in previous years covering organized crime in Mexico. Shortly after midnight, distant gunfire echoed through the northern districts. It was sporadic but precise, confirming reports that multiple factions were striking at the same time across the city. Vehicles previously abandoned during the day now formed barricades, signaling allegiance, marking territory, and sending messages to rival factions. The intent was not merely to attack, it was to communicate power visibly and indisputably. I activated my recorder and took rapid notes, documenting each observable movement. Federal sources confirmed that armored SUVs were carrying high-ranking members of Los Chapitos into strategic locations. Simultaneously, Mayo Zambada loyalists positioned themselves to respond, demonstrating a level of coordination that suggested prior planning rather than impromptu retaliation. As the night progressed, the city became a stage of orchestrated chaos. Convoys traveled from one district to another, banners were displayed prominently in public squares, and checkpoints manned by armed operatives effectively partitioned neighborhoods. Residents, forced to remain indoors, watched cautiously from windows or documented the events on encrypted platforms. The psychological impact was profound. Fear had become a tool, as visible and deliberate as gunfire itself. From my rooftop position, I observed a series of coordinated movements that crystallized the night's significance. Vehicles were abandoned strategically to block intersections, symbolic messages were posted in locations intended to be highly visible, and armed groups made calculated appearances in key areas to reinforce territorial claims. Each act was part of a broader psychological campaign designed to communicate dominance and control over both rival factions and civilians alike. At around 2 a.m., a source embedded with state intelligence provided confirmation of additional activity in another district. Armed men were maneuvering in coordinated patterns, setting up temporary barricades, and establishing visual dominance points. I cross-referenced this with citizen footage circulating online, which depicted simultaneous displays in neighborhoods separated by several kilometers. The scale of the operation was staggering. The entire city had become a canvas for the Sinaloa Cartel's messaging strategy. Throughout the night, intermittent gunfire, vehicle movements, and banners continued. Federal authorities attempted containment where possible, but the simultaneous nature of the displays made full control impossible. My documentation focused on observable events, corroborated with intelligence sources to ensure factual accuracy. Every convoy, every barricade, every public display reinforced the story I had been piecing together for weeks. This was a civil war conducted not only through force but through psychologically orchestrated public demonstrations. By pre-dawn hours, the first light revealed the extent of the night's orchestrated chaos. Intersections were blocked, vehicles abandoned, and banners marked key districts. News outlets later described the night as one of the most visible and coordinated displays of cartel power in Culiacán's history. As an investigative journalist, I had observed it in real time, documenting not only the actions but the impact on the urban landscape and its residents. The climax of the night was not just physical violence but strategic messaging, the simultaneous displays, the psychological pressure exerted on the population, and the visible assertion of dominance between Los Chapitos and Mayo Zambada's loyalists. My role as an observer allowed me to capture the narrative of a city under siege, where the line between territory, perception, and psychological control was deliberately blurred. As dawn approached, the streets slowly cleared. Armed convoys retreated to safe locations, banners remained as public statements of control, and residents cautiously emerged to assess the aftermath. The immediate threat had subsided, but the city bore the marks of a night carefully designed to assert dominance and send a message to all who witnessed it. After witnessing coordinated, citywide acts of intimidation and violence, how do you interpret power and control in such a context? Would you feel the impact as a citizen, an observer, or both? Comment below. By morning, the city had returned to its uneasy routine, but the significance of what I had observed remained. The coordinated actions of Los Chapitos and Mayo Zambada's loyalists had achieved their objective, a public display of power, control, and psychological dominance. As I reviewed my notes and footage, I realized that the full story of this civil war was far from over, yet this night would remain a defining chapter in the history of Culiacán and the Sinaloa Cartel. By the morning following the night of coordinated public displays, Culiacán awoke to a city visibly marked by the Sinaloa Cartel's civil war. Intersections still bore abandoned vehicles, banners hung from rooftops declaring allegiance, and graffiti communicated warnings that would linger for weeks. Yet, life, fragile and resilient, resumed. Vendors returned to markets, buses ran their routes cautiously, and residents emerged from the relative safety of their homes to survey the aftermath. As I walked through the northern districts, documenting the physical and psychological impact of the night, the scale of what had occurred became clear. This was more than a clash of factions, it was a meticulously orchestrated public assertion of power. Los Chapitos and Mayo Zambada's loyalists had demonstrated their dominance simultaneously across multiple districts, ensuring that the population, rival factions, and authorities alike were aware of the new balance of power. I met with local residents, some of whom agreed to speak on background. Their accounts emphasized not only fear but also an uneasy understanding of the faction's message. One shop owner described closing early the night before, watching from his window as armored SUVs patrolled nearby. "They want us to know who controls where," he said quietly. "We live, we adapt, and we survive. There's no other choice." The public dimension of this conflict, visible vehicles, banners, graffiti, and strategic checkpoints, had been intended to communicate dominance. But its impact went beyond intimidation. It revealed a calculated use of psychology and perception in modern cartel operations. My role as a journalist had been to observe, document, and analyze, ensuring that the narrative was preserved with accuracy, context, and depth. Over the next few days, reports from federal authorities confirmed the details I had gathered firsthand. Multiple districts had been targeted simultaneously, key members of both factions had been strategically positioned, and no single neighborhood remained unaffected. The coordinated actions were unprecedented in both scale and visibility, marking a turning point in the history of Culiacán and in the operational strategies of the Sinaloa Cartel. As I compiled footage and notes, I reflected on the human dimension. Residents had endured a night of strategic terror yet continued their routines with cautious resilience. Children returned to schools, vendors reopened their stalls, and families ventured out for essential errands. The city had absorbed the psychological impact of orchestrated violence and was beginning the slow process of adaptation. In my own review, I recognized patterns that had previously eluded me. The simultaneous displays were not only about intimidation but also communication, signals to rivals and messages to allies. Safe houses, convoys, and public barricades had been positioned with careful intent. Even the banners and graffiti were part of a broader narrative, telling a story of power, loyalty, and control that transcended individual acts of violence. I visited one of the neighborhoods most affected by the night's events. Residents recounted fear, uncertainty, and grief, but also a quiet determination. Life went on, despite the omnipresent threat. I recorded their testimonies, careful to contextualize the events for audiences who might only see headlines without understanding the intricacies of the Civil War. By the end of the first week, the city was still scarred but resilient. The coordinated public displays had achieved their intended effect, power was communicated, rival factions had acknowledged one another's reach, and the civilian population had internalized the new reality. Yet, amidst the fear, I observed traces of human resilience, determination, and adaptation, qualities that would define Culiacán long after the night of blood and banners. Reflecting on my own experience, I understood the significance of being a witness. Documenting these events was not about sensationalism, it was about preserving truth, capturing patterns, and providing insight into the mechanisms of organized crime and the human impact of psychological warfare. I had observed, verified, and contextualized actions that would later define the Civil War in historical and sociological terms. Reflection question: Final CTA. After witnessing events designed to intimidate an entire city, how do you interpret resilience and survival? What lessons about human endurance and adaptation can we draw from communities living under constant threat? Share your thoughts below. By the second week, some visible signs of the night's events had been removed, vehicles were towed, banners taken down, and graffiti painted over. Yet the memory persisted, etched into the city's collective consciousness and the minds of residents. For me, the experience underscored the dual role of a journalist, to witness and to convey not only facts but context, insight, and the human dimension of conflict. As I packed my equipment to leave Culiacán, I reflected on the journey I had undertaken, the warnings I had followed, the patterns I had uncovered, the chaos I had documented, and the clarity I had gained. The city had endured a night that tested both its streets and its people, and in doing so, revealed the calculated complexity of the Sinaloa Cartel's operations. In the aftermath, Culiacán remained a city of contrasts: resilience and fear, survival and dominance, chaos and structure. As a witness to history, my role had been to capture the narrative, analyze patterns, and provide insight that could inform understanding of organized crime and the enduring impact on civilians. The civil war within the Sinaloa Cartel had left visible and psychological marks across Culiacán. Yet, amidst the orchestrated terror, the city persisted. Life returned, carefully, cautiously, but persistently. And for those of us documenting the events, the lesson was clear: even in the shadow of violence and intimidation, human resilience endures, communities adapt, and truth, when observed with diligence, is preserved. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.